everybody, it's Nicole Byer here with some hot takes from Wayfair. A cozy corduroy sectional from Wayfair? Yeah, that's a hot take. Go on and add it to your cart and take it. A pink glam nightstand from Wayfair? Scalding hot take. Take it before I do. A mid-century modern cabinet from Wayfair that doubles as a wine bar? Do I have to say it? It's a hot take. Get it at wayfair.com and enjoy that free shipping too.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
When you think of skyrocketing brands like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, it's easy to credit their success to great products, sleek branding, and brilliant marketing. But here's the overlooked secret. The real magic lies in the engine behind the scenes, the business powering their business. For millions of brands, that engine is Shopify, making selling seamless for them and shopping effortless for us. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Aloe Yoga uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/retail, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/retail to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/retail.
Again to the Explaining History podcast, and I wanted to talk today about a book that sat on my shelf for a long time. I bought it years ago, long time ago now, and I've never really done anything with it. And there's a reason why I want to talk about it today. This particular book, not just because it's one of those ones I kind of regret not diving into. It guides us through a kind of a very unexplored British colonial history, one relating to the Middle East and particularly to Saudi Arabia. And it's the story of one of the great Arabists of modern British history, St John Philby, the father of King Philby, Harold King Philby, the Soviet agent embedded in MI6, traitor, and the kind of inspiration for much of John le Carré's work. And Philby Senior, St John Philby, was also a spy, but a spy in Arabia. During the First World War and afterwards, and has the temerity by the 1930s to convert to Islam and to advise the Saudi King Ibn Saud on how to unify Arabia and how to take advantage of the enormous wealth that is underneath the sand. And for this, he was never really forgiven. St John Philby is a very eccentric character. In the Philip Knightley biography of King Philby, which is one of the kind of the more authentic accounts, because it's written almost with Philby's kind of by him. Apparently, St John Philby's last words in 1960, when he was sat on the balcony of Philby's house in Lebanon with a glass of scotch, was, "God, I'm bored," and then he dropped dead. So that gives you a measure of the guy. But it also, I think that one of the interesting parts about St John Philby's story, the bit we're going to look at today, is the extent to which ethnographers, geographers, linguists, people that Orientalists, these extraordinary, eccentric, and often very driven characters who were able to navigate the kinds of terrain that only the Bedouin had been able to cross, who came to learn local languages and understand everything about the places they had gone to, albeit from an outsider and an inherently colonial point of view. I mean, Ibn Saud no doubt had a huge amount to say about people like St John Philby, but they understood the Middle East in ways that people in Westminster and colonial administrators in India, who were the other kind of the other pole really of power in their lives, they came to understand Arabia in ways that those people just simply couldn't. And so they were useful tools in navigating and negotiating with local rulers. And this is what the British Empire kind of excelled at, was to come to arrangements with local rulers, often to play them off against other factions and groups, to divide and rule, and to ensure that there were local rulers who did quite well out of the bargain, who did quite well out of the deal. So Philby was basically, during the First World War, sent to Mesopotamia, and he is sent there as a kind of by the government in India, and he's sent there to be essentially the financial controller. He arrives there in 1915, and obviously at this point, with the exception of southern, what would now be southern Iraq, everything else has been is under kind of Ottoman control, and the British have a very difficult time all the way up to 1917 in Mesopotamia. It's very, very difficult for them to conquer, and the Turks fight far harder than and are far better organised than the British had bargained for. But what was Philby there to do? He's there basically to be the paymaster for the Arab Revolt that the British have planned, and the roots of that, which it kind of explodes across Arabia, from across the Hejaz in Arabia in 1916. But the British had a kind of a very well thought out strategy of undermining the Ottoman Empire, causing it to hopefully implode, and thus removing really the southern flank of Germany's of the Central Powers. If the Ottoman Empire collapsed, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire particularly would be dangerously exposed. So he does have an extremely important role. But anyway, we're going to dive into this book. It's called Philby of Arabia, by the late historian Elizabeth Munro, who was connected to both of Philby's families, Philby's first British family and his later Saudi family. Elizabeth Munro writes, when Philby and his fellow linguist sailed up the Shat al-Arab waterway and anchored off Basra on November the 20th, 1915, he entered in his diary that the waterway was thronged with ships and looked like business. So it ought to do, for the force sent from India to keep the Persian Gulf free of enemies and friendly to Britain had been at work for me that year. Had been at work for more than a year. But on landing, they learned that appearances were deceptive. Originally, the dispatch of troops to Mesopotamia had been intended as a mere demonstration. The force sent from India consisted of only 5,000 men, and its accompanying political officer, Sir Percy Cox, was given only one assistant, one Indian clerk, and 2 peons to see him through. It was supposed to achieve 3 objectives by means of a show of might: to put heart into friendly Arab sheikhs and rulers, to protect the oil fields in South Persia, which were run by a British company and provided the only British-controlled source of oil for the navy, and to block the passage of German agents into Persia in the general direction of India. So that's fascinating. Here we are in a time where Iran once again is in the kind of the West's crosshairs. Iran, where the CIA and MI6 overthrew its democratically elected leader in 1953 when there was talk of nationalizing Iran's oil resources, an unreasonable objective, one would argue. And Iran, or Persia as it was at the time, that by the First World War was the main petrol station, basically, for the British Royal Navy, which was rapidly being converted from coal-powered ships to oil-powered. By the time of Philby's arrival, the oil fields were safe, and some of the Arabs were friendly, but other political problems were still unsolved in spite of the efforts of Sir Percy Cox, for whom he was to work. Cox, originally a soldier, had taken to political work in the 1890s, and had been the government of India's political resident in the Persian Gulf from 1904 to 1913. He therefore had inestimable advantage of old acquaintance with Arab chiefs with whom he had now to deal. Of these, the most important were Mubarak, Sheikh of Kuwait; Khazal, Sheikh of Mhamara, who controlled the Persian shore of the Shatt al-Arab, all the way down to the oil refinery at Abadan; Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, the Emir of Najd in Arabia, who had been strong enough to turn the Turks out of the coastal province of Al-Hassa in 1913. Cox, thanks to long experience, also had a measure of a more slippery character, Sayyid Talib, the son of the Nakib of Basra, who had said he would like the kind of recognition accorded to his neighbours of Kuwait and Marmara, but whose sincerity Cox found doubtful. For Talib had not only conducted shady ventures while in Turkish service before the war, but had, as soon as the British had landed in 1914, slipped off to consult Ibn Saud about how to react. He'd come away chastened and, Cox reported, entirely submissive. Nevertheless, Cox had taken the precaution of sending him to Bombay as a state guest. A good way of removing somebody from the picture so that they might possibly not be free to return. A polite way of essentially kidnapping.
Shop the Sherwin-Williams 4th of July sale and get 30% off paints and stains June 27th through July 7th. With prices starting at $34.29, it's the perfect time to transform your space with color. Whether you're looking to revamp your interior or exterior, we have you covered with bold hues, soothing neutrals, and everything in between. Visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store or shop the sale online. Delivery available on qualifying orders. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Soldiers, apart from protecting the oil fields, had begun less successfully. Their lines outside Basra were under constant attack from desert tribes, who at the start raided the town. British troops from India had been trained for quite another purpose, fighting Russia on the northwest frontier, and their equipment for desert warfare was defective. They had brought the wrong kind of transport and were short of good maps. Their intelligence about Turkish dispositions was far less efficient than it might have been, for they had been scarcely troubled to scour India for British officers who knew the country. To give 2 examples of their complacency, they left pining on the northwest frontier one explorer of the Arabian Desert, Captain G.E. Leachman of the Royal Sussex Regiment, who had twice paid long visits to the Mesopotamian tribes and who knew Ibn Saud, Well, Captain Hubert Young of the Maharatta Horse, who had travelled overland on his way back from leave in 1913, had been told that army intelligence in India needed no special information about the areas through which he would pass. Military ignorance of tribal affiliations was therefore abysmal, and while fighting in Mesopotamia was unlike that in Western Arabia, where Arabs who backed the revolt of Sharif Hussein of Mecca fought on the British side, the Mesopotamian tribes had no overall leader and fought either on their own account or else as intermittent allies of their co-religionists, the Turks. By the standards of the British force, they were raiders of stores and pillagers of the dead, and were good for nothing beyond loot. For lack of information about them, the British command was often reduced to guesswork about the wisdom of advancing. So again, there are all these kind of colonial assumptions about the Arab tribes of Mesopotamia, made by the British, who, had they been slightly better organised, might have been able to have a couple of very good liaison people right there. Cox and his meagre staff of politicals were better informed, but even they knew only the coastal sheikhs. They also worked under the handicap that none of the British government departments that felt entitled to a say in Mesopotamia, the India Office, the Government of India, Commander-in-Chief in India, War Office, Foreign Office, Admiralty, had made up its mind what was to happen to the land if conquered. Some judged its future from the standpoint of imperial strategy and wanted possession of a terminus for a British-controlled railway from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, to be used for ferrying troops to and fro in the event of a war with Russia. Others wanted possession either because they'd smelt oil at Mosul, which had definitely been smelt by this point. Lloyd George at the Paris Peace Conference offers Clemenceau a kind of French influence in Syria in return for Mosul. Clemenceau gobbles it up. He takes the bait. The French had long designs on Syria. However, the finding out that the oil was in Mosul was something of a shock to Clemenceau, and he felt betrayed by Lloyd George and extremely angry. But par for the course, really. Others wanted possession either because they had smelled oil in Mosul or because, peeping from between Indian blinkers, they wanted to appropriate as a colony a supposed Garden of Eden that India could irrigate, run, and settle with the martial races of the Punjab. One of Cox's more delicate tasks was to behave to the Arabs as if the Turks would never come back, so dispelling their fear of a day of vengeance, while giving Britain's European allies the impression that she was not planning a permanent grab of Ottoman territory. Religious as well as political questions loaded his desk. Were Arab mosques to be freely used by Indian Muslim troops? What was to be done with subscriptions that the faithful wanted to send to shrines inside Turkey? Who was to reassure the Indian troops that the holy places, if conquered, would remain in Muslim hands? To help him juggle with such problems, he at once recruited two good men whose work he had known in the Persian Gulf, notably Arnold Wilson, who knew South Persia, and W. H. Shakespeare, the political agent in Kuwait. The latter he sent inland to introduce Ibn Saud to attack the Saudis' hereditary enemy and the Turks' ally, Ibn Rashid of Khail in Central Arabia. Flank attacks on Basra's defences continued to be a nuisance. In the summer of 1915, therefore, Cox and the soldiers agreed to venture on an advance that would cover Basra better and earn respect locally, as well as in India, for British successor arms. In the summer heat, while an army inched northwards, taking first Kurna, where the Tigris and Euphrates joined to form the Shatt al-Arab waterway, and then towns further up the rivers, and beyond the marshes that lie between them, Cox thought desperately short Cox, though desperately short of administrative staff, made a rule of putting a political officer wherever the troops went, hoping to secure the army's rear and to forestall unfriendly Arab comment by giving similar treatment to similar problems. By October, cooler weather and army success were thought to warrant a more ambitious plan. Some signal below, said an India office minute, was needed to offset failure in Gallipoli and to cut Turco-German communications with Persia, which constituted a threat to India. Everyone admitted that were the Turks to riposte. Large-scale reinforcements from Europe were out of the question, and from India were dubious for reasons of internal security. So it's a huge gamble. If the Turks' response to Britain's kind of adventurism in Mesopotamia is really pretty robust, then there's no way of reinforcing the expeditionary force in Mesopotamia, and this leads to the disaster of Kut al-Amara later on. Nevertheless, political reasoning prompted a dash for Baghdad. The name was magical, but the burden would be great. It was this prospect of acquiring a further large tract of territory to run, including a major city, that caused Cox to cable to India for more political officers, specifying that these must be linguists. And here's where Philby comes in. Philby's companions included travelling soldiers, among them Hubert Young, and an even better linguist than himself, B.R.L. Lorimer. Calling at Cox's office on arrival, the newcomers learned the bad news. The Turks had hit back. The British Army under General Townsend had fought a desperate battle with them at Ctesiphon, south of Baghdad, and had been defeated, and were already in retreat towards Kut, a third of the way back to Basra. The ships in the Shat were about to become hospital ships, overcrowded, insanitary, and understaffed. Cox's office was plunged into uncertainty. He himself was away up the river, and Arnold Wilson had broken down from overwork. As between Philby and Young, one had been destined for Baghdad. Now no one knew whether either was going to go forward. Philby, after 3 days of waiting for orders and chafing for war work, wrote home that he was bored. There you go, bored. He tried his halting Arabic, which he could read but scarcely speak, on date pickers pressing down their wares with their bare feet. In order to hear the language spoken, he went to a so-called nightclub, and even to a church service in Arabic run by an American missionary, John Van Ness. He was, as usual, frank with Van Ness and his wife about his motive. "It's the first time I've entered a church since I got married." After a week, he met the great Cox, who looked like a tall version of the Duke of Wellington, and was told that his assignment was to study the finances of the occupied territory and draw up a regular system of civil accounts. This was his best line, and he was delighted. He found that the accounts had so far been run by a stickler for the old Indian civil accounts code. Indeed, he soon discovered that the whole system of government had been organised, regardless of local conditions, on Indian civil service lines. Law, order, justice, customs, police methods, and currency were all imported from India. Even servants, machine men, and flyboys had been sent to replace incompetent local hands. Injunctions from London that Basra province is not India, or much like any part of India, no attempt must be made to render it so, had fallen on deaf ears because the Turks, though freely criticised as bad administrators, had left it in good enough order to carry away their files, land registers, and accounts. So the Turks had taken away, and this is a really interesting kind of ploy. They had taken away any record of who owned what. And, of course, one of the first things the domestic population is going to want any new power to ensure is their property rights. A farmer might say to the new British administration, well, so-and-so has taken part of my land and there's no record of anything. And the Turks knew full well that this would cause absolute chaos. And it's the sort of the thing that local resentments are made of. Civil servants from India, obliged to start running a territory in which there was no precedence except hearsay, naturally improvised on lines that they knew. But Philby preferred to use his powers of organisation on another tack, for it seemed to him obvious that time and effort would be saved were he to devise a system of accounts to cover not only civilian but military expenditure. He sat up till all hours planning such a system and getting it ready to go into operation on January the 1st. On nights when he grew stale from overwork, he read the New Testament in Arabic aloud to his Arab servant. Over bridge one evening, he heard gossip that suggested to him that his job would not be so unfettered as he had hoped. The players were discussing the impending return from sick leave of Arnold T. Wilson, who appears to be a forcible sort of person, but with a great influence with Cox. He and Wilson met and crossed swords for the first of many times. When A.T. made it plain that he did not like the system that Philby had devised for the accounts, on this subject, he did not have the last word, and Philby continued on his own lines. Basra was, and still is, not so much one town as three. Its port, its riverbanks, and its business area was some way but part, when the only means of transport between them was a horse-drawn gharry or a bicycle. And Philby's office was comfortably far from Wilson's, but it was also far from necessary files, a drawback that he resolved with disregard for the convenience of colleagues. I created my own separate files with parental solicitude, he remembered with satisfaction 30 years later, and filled them with papers purloined from the files of the political and other officers. Slowly but surely, I dug myself into the financial trenches. So, I'm going to leave the kind of the monologue there because there's a couple of things just to kind of unpack there. Firstly, you have a number of conditions happening. You have war, obviously, the conquest of southern Iraq, where very quickly, in order to make things function for the purposes of the further defeat of the Ottomans, eventually, hopefully the British will succeed in that, you need to have civilian order, and you need to have a system that runs, it has been told from the colonial office, don't change things, don't impose an Indian, a British colonial Indian style system of government here. We kind of haven't got the time, and we don't want to start kind of trouble with the locals. That's the last thing we want. But obviously, there is no choice but then to do that, because the Turks have removed all the kind of the means of governance as any sensible retreating force would do. And so Philby is one of these kind of I don't want to say maverick, because that can't really mean anything, but a obviously very clever guy, very kind of focused, committed guy, and somebody that needs to, on the ground, establish ways of running things that the colonial administrators in London and Delhi don't even know that they need. And then is forced to fight these kind of little internecine battles with people like Wilson, just to in order to kind of establish his kind of system of administration. Philby is quite kind of the sort of like anarchic, almost sort of quite nihilistic sort of character, and I don't think particularly cared very much about. He certainly wasn't a particularly patriotic guy. He was a guy who wanted to achieve certain things. He wanted to, and almost kind of achieve them for their own sake. There's a lot more to be said about him and about his particular kind of class position. These were the sort of the they're in the top tier of British society for sure, but they were the sort of the wealthy poor, the Philbys. they're not at the heart of Britain's establishment. They are kind of the sorts of people who send their children to elite schools, and yet somehow they never quite have the money or the status to be at the top tier of that elite. And so he never felt deep ties and loyalties to the particular ruling class of Great Britain, and gradually, as time goes by, his kind of commitment to and affections for Arabia seemed to kind of make his ties with Britain ever weaker. But we'll return to look at him another time. But I think he's one of these important characters to look at. Somebody who becomes becomes a kind of in crude language, kind of goes native. He converts to Islam. He learns Arabic and becomes much more tied to Arabia than he is to Great Britain. Anyway, I'll leave you to digest that one, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. We had some great responses to our austerity podcast yesterday, and I just kind of on the subject of that, put a bit of a shout out to people around the world who listen to this podcast. You've got my email address, or if you don't, it's nick_shepley@hotmail.com. And I'm just kind of interested if that resonated with you, if that podcast on austerity and poverty resonated with you where you are, wherever that is in the world, and if you've experienced, the hardship, and if you've experienced kind of governmental austerity policies, I'd like to talk to you. I'd like to hear what life is like where you are in the world. So give me a shout, and I'm sure we can have a great conversation. Take care now. All the best. Bye-bye.